Hello, and thank you for tuning in to The Christian Skeptic. I'm your host, Sean Kerwin, and as always, it's my mission to take an honest look at our questions about Christianity through the lens of logic and reason. I'm not here to preach at you, just to start a conversation with you. I hope you enjoy the show.
So welcome back to the second part in our discussion on morality. If you missed the last episode, go ahead and listen to it. Go back and check it out. But as a quick summary, the last episode was about morality as defined by humans through a process of evolution and a unique rising of a hierarchy in human desires, essentially, is what morality must be predicated on if it's defined by us. What I want to present as the counter argument today is morality as discovered by us. And so, words to know before we go: ontology and epistemology are two words that are going to be important to today's discussion. And they're important because they distinguish our relationship or lack thereof to a moral code. And so what I mean by that is I want to talk about moral ontology, which ontology is essentially just the being of something, right? The study of its existence and perhaps even some of its metaphysical properties. So it's a much more philosophical discussion. The second word is epistemology, which is the theory and the study of our knowledge of a thing. And why I want to separate these two is because I want to approach this topic how it should properly be approached. I think in Christian circles, and I want to be careful of doing this so as not to be overly biased and try to approach this as objectively as possible, but in Christian circles, the argument often goes, and I want to avoid this argument today, is, well, if there is no God, there's no absolute morality, and then everything's permissible. But we know that everything's not permissible, and that's why the Nazis can be convicted of crimes against humanity. And I know I brought that up last time, and I might reference it again today. Who knows where we're going with this? But it's that idea that because there's a God, there has to be laws. And so I want to kind of maybe back into that if we can, and we'll look at moral ontology and epistemology in and of themselves before we make the argument that God must be the one that makes a moral code and moral laws. Not to say that I'm not going to make that argument at all, because you can't really separate these. If you make the claim that morals have an ontological nature in and of themselves, you can only make this claim as it appeals to our reason and logic as humans. And essentially, we make this claim because of the epistemology of morality. So my argument here is also factoring in the idea of truth as a philosophical fixed point, which in other words means that truth is objectively out there, and that is truth's ontology, that something is true whether we know it or not, whether we prove it or not. And I think maybe the simplest example to flesh this out in our minds is the example of mathematics. Like, math is an interesting idea. If I ask you what is math, you can say it's the formal definition, which is a field of study that uses numbers and abstract symbols to represent concepts and relationships. But that doesn't actually tell you what math is. That doesn't tell you that adding things grows them. That doesn't tell you that subtracting things shrinks them. That doesn't tell you that multiplying things grows them faster and dividing things shrinks them faster. And those are just the basics, right? You get into algebraic formulas and calculus, and you want to talk about math monetarily. There's compound interest and all kinds of different complexities and nuances within math. To just tell you what math is and where it comes from is kind of a headache. It makes more sense just to start walking through math and start giving you formulas. Even what I just said, 2 + 2 = 4. That's an example of math and not the definition of math. And so math is then a philosophical fixed truth point in that math will still be true whether we use it or not. 2 + 2 will still equal 4, even if I say 2 + 2 = 100. And I know you're probably thinking, well, you could just define 100 as 4, but that would be breaking the law of identity, which is one of the first principles of logic that Aristotle established, and no rational person does that. It's a silly example to bring up. And so the epistemology of truth, then, is our knowledge of reality. which is discovered by reason. So in other words, a statement that matches or corresponds to reality is true. And that makes sense to us. If we say something in a subjective truth claim and it matches the subjective truth claims of most other people, we can rationally deduce that the subjective truth is most likely an objective truth. So on a sunny day, if I go out and say the sky is blue and 100 other people agree with me, well then objectively the sky is probably blue, and that's a truth of that day. And so subjectively, if I say 2 + 2 = 4 and hundreds of people agree with me, then what we've done is we've not defined a truth of mathematics, we've discovered a truth of mathematics. If 100 of us take 2 objects and add 2 objects to them and count, and that equals 4 objects, then we have not defined a mathematical formula, we've discovered a mathematical formula. And so the argument for a pre-existing moral code or a moral code given by a lawgiver hinges on the epistemology of morality, which is our discovery of morality, much like mathematics. And you don't have to take evolution and everything we talked about in the last episode out of this equation for this to be true. Actually, I would argue that you add an evolutionary process of defining moral codes into this, and it makes this argument more true. And let me explain what I mean here. So if the ontology of morality is that a moral code exists outside of humanity, which is the argument for morality, that no matter what we do, just like mathematics, there are moral shoulds and should nots. There are moral ought and ought not tos, right? There is a right and a wrong that objectively exists outside of our human desires for pleasure or power. And again, see the example from last episode of the Nazis being convicted in the Nuremberg trials for crimes against humanity. This was an entire nation, an entire people group that agreed on a moral code, but the rest of the world appealed to a higher moral code, one outside of humanity, to convict them of crimes against humanity. And so the moral code used at the Nuremberg trials was a moral code that found its ontology outside of the human mind. And this doesn't mean outside of a rational mind, actually far from it, because our reasoning would lead us to deduce that all morals are more rational than humans are actually capable of. And when I say humans are capable of, I don't think I necessarily mean collectively capable of, but maybe individually capable of. That the moral code, if it finds its ontology outside of our human mind, must be as rational as a mathematical code. And we are still discovering complexities and laws inside the mathematical code that exists outside of us. See quantum physics as an example of that. Like we didn't know that for a long time, right? And now we have these theories, and we're discovering something that matches or corresponds to the observable reality around us. So it's like we're shedding light on the philosophical fixed point of quantum physics and quantum mathematics. Well, the same, I think, is true in morality. And so as humans evolve, and we take the same story from the last episode, right? We discover things. We discover that, okay, being honest with people is actually really beneficial. Let's write that into the moral code. I don't think we've defined a moral code based on our biology and our biological need for survival and propagation. And, I actually even heard a theory that evolution is perhaps advancing even more rapidly than before, but it's advancing culturally. And I thought that was a really fascinating idea. But I think that actually lends itself more to a moral ontology existing outside of the human mind. That as we advance more, as we become more interconnected as humans, we are discovering the objective moral code. Now, that discovery process is hard. And I think child development psychologist Piaget has a pretty good theory about how children kind of discover the world, and that his theory is that children bounce off of things, that children bounce off of ideas. And one of the examples of that is if you hang a mobile above a baby, the baby's going to hit it and kick it, but that hitting and kicking is actually the baby's mind formulating and developing and essentially mapping out what exists in the reality outside of the baby's ontology, right? Outside of the baby's being. So there's an epistemological process happening when you see a baby kicking and flailing and hitting a mobile and bouncing off walls and pulling your hair, and all of that stuff is actually a very complex process of discovery of what the world is. And I submit to you that we do that with morality, but we do it as adults. And so it gets very messy and ugly and complex and complicated, and we need these wild trials and arguments and law debates to kick and to bounce and to hit off of something so that maybe we can land on what is the moral code, what is the ethical decision point that we should make that sheds more light on the philosophical fixed point of a moral ontology. What corresponds to and matches reality best when it comes to morals? That's the process of discovery. That's the epistemological side to morality. And we're not there yet. And so, okay, now let's throw God into the mix, right? God inspires his word. We'll take a very Christian premise here, that God has inspired many people to write down his word, and we'll start with Moses, the first one to write down the Torah, that God actually spoke to Moses. God actually wrote with his own hand on some tablets 10 rules that established a deep epistemological relationship between humans and a morally metaphysical ontological reality with which we were disconnected with as far as a straight line of sight goes. God comes and gives us a straight line of sight in the form of 10 commandments. And from those 10 commandments, he continues speaking to Moses, and we have Leviticus, and we have Deuteronomy, the second telling of the law. He tells it to him twice, right? That's what Deuteronomy means. So, okay, that's still a process of discovery. I argue that we are no more ontologically connected with the moral code because God gives us 10 commandments than we are if he doesn't. I think we're more epistemologically connected with the moral code, meaning that our knowledge and clarity is deeper. So essentially, God is the calculus teacher who has given us the fundamental and first principle equations in our journey of discovering morality, like our journey of discovering mathematics would be in a classroom setting, if we're going to compare morality to mathematics. But it doesn't mean we know every single thing about calculus for having sat in his class. It means that the teacher had an agenda. It means that the teacher said, what in this class will help best prepare you for the future career ahead of you? So I'm an engineer. I took calculus. What in my calculus class prepared me best for engineering? If my teacher was intimately involved in every detail of my life and knew my future, he would have been able to really answer that and really focus in on the concepts that mattered most. But it doesn't mean that I knew everything about calculus when I left that class. And in the same way, the Judeo-Christian idea of God's revelation of a moral code to us does not teach us every single thing we need to know about morality. And it also does not prove the ontological existence of morality as a philosophical fixed point of truth. And it doesn't need to. And that's okay from a Christian perspective, because the late great pastor Tim Keller once said that there are two ways to try to save yourself without God. The first way is to try to save yourself by going and building your own heaven and doing whatever you want and completely ignoring God and leaving him out of the picture. The second way is to try to save yourself through obedience to the moral code. And the gospel is the only way that says you cannot save yourself. Therefore, be a Christian so you can get God, because God's the one that can save you, right? And so from a Christian perspective, it's okay that God doesn't give us the entire moral code in the Torah. It's okay that God doesn't give us the full rational argument for a moral ontological existence outside of humanity. He was never meant to do that. Just like it's okay that God doesn't give us all the laws of mathematics in the Bible. And that's because from a Christian perspective, we were never meant to know the moral code on a deep ontological level. We are meant to know God on a deep ontological level. But it's tough to wrestle with this, right? It gets messy when we bring ethics into morals. And that, I think, is the biggest argument against a moral ontological existence outside of our human desires, mind, comprehension, and rationality, is that we get it wrong. Is that, going back to Piaget's example of a child bouncing off of things and kicking and pulling hair and doing all of this stuff, is that a lot of people see that child and they yell at that child. And don't get me wrong, sometimes children need to be corrected and disciplined. I'm not saying never to do that. But sometimes you go to a church and you bounce off of something, and you bounce off an idea, and maybe you pull someone's hair and you're the outcast, and you get yelled at and you get punished, or you get judged silently by everyone else that sees what you're doing. And it's like you're just experimenting with what is this not fully yet discovered ontological moral reality, and especially not by you, especially not if you're growing up in a church. And churches get it wrong sometimes. And you might have discovered something that's a part of morality that maybe isn't good, but maybe also isn't bad. Like one example that I can think of that is maybe an older example, and I think churches are moving away from this, but for a long time here in America, tattoos were thought to be contrary to the moral code. Sometimes people were actually told they were going to hell for having tattoos. And now, if you're in Christian circles and you bring that up, everyone can kind of laugh at that. But nevertheless, it still hurt people. It still made people have this idea of, wait a second, tattoos are not contrary to the moral code. Therefore, the church must be wrong. Therefore, there must not be an actual moral code outside of humanity, because the church is just saying whatever they feel like is right is right. So why can't I just say whatever I feel like is right is right? And thus, without rationality, we add credence to the argument for a positive law only moral theory and a defined morality, defined only by human desires for pleasure and for power. But make no mistake, a positive law theory has that as its core rationality, that not everyone gets morality right, so therefore there must not be a right morality. But a natural law theory, I submit to you, has greater rationality at its core. And I would actually argue to that point that because the moral problems and disagreements among us and that we have with each other are so polarizing and are so harsh, that does point to evidence that morality, facts about what one ought to do and ought not to do, and then the epistemological application of those, which is what we call ethics, must be grounded outside of a human source of rationality. Human rationality can be used to discover those, but because our human rationality often fails us, while at the same time our human rationality also compels us to the application of laws, again, whether through an evolutionary process or not, and I think the evolutionary process actually adds more credibility to this, that because our biology programs us, compels us to enforce some existence of a moral code, whether it be inside or outside of our rationality, that biological programming is there, then I submit to you that that tension adds evidence to a moral code having an ontological existence that supersedes human desire and rationality. But human rationality is what our knowledge and understanding, our epistemology of that moral code depends on. And so therefore, good moral actions please us because they should please us, not just because we find pleasure in them. Like, it adds a depth to the feeling we have when we see positive or negative actions in morality. Negative actions in morality should displease us, should unsettle us. Because in other words, if that wasn't the case, I don't think we would see a universal clamor for justice. Like, if that wasn't the case, and there wasn't a moral code that existed outside of us, why would we care about justice in Africa or China? And I'm speaking as an American, right? Obviously, if you're in Africa or China, then you really care. But you have no reason to care about justice in America because that's not your tribe. If our inclination for a universal external moral code didn't already pre-exist in our biological programming, then why not just look at the Nazis and say, well, what they did was fine for them. They're a different tribe than us. We don't agree with their tribe, but we're going to distance ourselves for survival from that tribe. We're going to even outcast them and maybe even commit crimes against humanity against them because there is no outside moral code. And this isn't the argument I didn't want to make in the beginning. This is the argument that C.S. Lewis gave, just applied a little differently. C.S. Lewis said that if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And of course, Lewis is speaking about heaven here. But I think the argument can apply here in morality. If we find in ourselves a desire that hinges upon an epistemological relationship with a moral code that we cannot see, just like a mathematical code that we cannot see but only discover, then maybe the smallest leap of faith and the most probable explanation is that just like the mathematical code that we've been discovering for thousands of years, there is a sister called the moral code that we have been discovering for equally as long, if not longer. And this is a very Aristotelian argument. Like Aristotle in his Metaphysics talks both about morality, theology, and mathematics together. And I know Aristotle's metaphysical interpretations of mathematics and science are really simplistic in nature, and a lot of other philosophers and scientists have looked at that and just said, yeah, that was like child's play, basically. That's not my point. My point is they go hand in hand. My point is a mathematical code that exists that we have to discover is no different than a moral code that exists that we have to discover. Only the moral code, figuring out formulas and equations and how things work, is a whole lot messier than the mathematical code. But those are my thoughts. I think this concludes our discussion on morality, but let me know what you think. If you want to talk about it more, feel free to write into the show, hit me up on social media, leave a comment, a review, like, subscribe, and share. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the show.